Hello and good day. We're going to be discussing a little bit more about GDP today, looking at our notes, and also going to make some headway into the other two main economic indicators, which are the CPI and unemployment. I thought you would have had a good weekend. I hope you did. So, get you warmed back up again. Let's take a look at a couple questions. Now, this isn't actually a test question. I say it's an economic indicator test question, but I posted this to Blackboard so you can have your own copy and print it up. So if you want to just take some notes along here, I think that you'll be able to get an idea of the type of questions and the nature of what I'm testing you for in future questions. Everybody looks so fantastic here in Stillwater. I'll always remember you this way. Okay, let's go. What's your formula for GDP? Yes?
The yearly GDP is equal to the consumption plus investment plus the, I don't remember, but it's like plus G plus net exports.
Very good. So the G stands for government, and it includes federal government, state government, and local government. Exports are going to be derived how? How do you come up with net exports?
The difference between your imports and your exports.
That's right. So this will be a positive number if you're selling more to other countries and you buy from other countries, and it'll be a negative number if you're like the United States, buying more from other countries than we sell to other countries. So provide an example where the GDP for the USA is, and here it is, 19 with 12 zeros after it. What is that number?
Trillion.
Yep. So we'd say 19 trillion is equal to, and then roughly the consumption of the United States. We have four categories here. Is it all about 25% each, all four, or which one is going to be the largest of the four? Consumption. It's about 2/3 of it. Let's say put 12 trillion down for that. If we know something about government spending, then we know that the federal government spends 4 trillion a year, and the state and local governments combined add up to another 1 trillion. So we got about 5 trillion total government spending. The net exports, we got to do this over here. So if we take our exports of about 1.2 trillion and we subtract 0.7 trillion, which is our I'm sorry, here we are. We purchase our imports and our exports. So imports good heavens. I just wrote it the wrong way. Okay. What do we export in the United States? It's 0.7 trillion. What do we import from other countries? It's 1.2 trillion. When we subtract those two, we get a negative 0.5 trillion. Very good. And that leaves investment, which is, give me some examples of investment so I know that that you know what investment is.
Would that be like a CD?
No, that's like consumer investing, or that's really the credit market. CDs, stock market, all that kind of stuff is not part of the GDP at all. So only production. So it's stuff that remember, this is households, this is government, this is other countries. So what's the three players in economics are households,
Like
government,
manufacturing, factories,
firms. That's right. Good. So if they buy warehouse shelving, if they buy a bunch of steel, if they purchase a lot of if they build a factory, if when a new store opens up, that they build a new Walmart, that's an investment. When they build a apartment complex, that's an investment. The actual physical purchasing of materials by firms in anticipation of future productivity. So a distribution center and so forth. You gotta go?
No.
Okay. Good. So those are things that firms do. So inventory, products that they're, the inputs that they purchase and so forth. In order to get this to work out to 19 trillion, what does investment have to be?
1.5.
Yeah, isn't it 2.5? Is it a negative? I think 17 minus a half is 16.5.
2.5.
Yeah, 2.5 trillion. Okay, good. All right, now we'll do it for, yes.
So say we were giving a question like this on the test, like how you just made like an average of the C value and the G value, would we have to make an average as well, or would you actually give us those numbers?
I would give you those numbers, and I would, there's a couple of things I wanted you to get out of this. One is the comfort level of working with trillions. I wanted you to notice that the consumption in the United States accounts for about 2/3 of the GDP of the United States. I wanted you to recognize that the next biggest group is government spending, which is a pretty substantial part, about let's say 30% or maybe 25% of the total GDP, and that we have. I think we talked last time that our net exports are negative, and that the smallest category outside of next export is investment. I also, if I were to ask a question along this line, I might, what I would do is I'd give you 4 of the 5 numbers, and you'd have to know what the other number was. So as long as you knew what the equation was, then that would be not a problem. I usually don't lay it out as an equation. It might be a word problem saying something like, if given a year where the GDP is 19 trillion, consumption is 12 trillion, and investment is 2.5 trillion, and where exports are equal to 0.7 trillion or 700 billion, and imports are 1.2 trillion, what is the amount of government spending? And I'll give you 5 choices. 1, 5, 4, 3, whatever, something. You'll be looking for the missing number. And if you, as long as you know the formula and you know how they're derived, then it's pretty straightforward. Okay, provide an example where the GDP for China is 12 trillion. So go ahead and give that a try there. Let me tell you that right now government spending in China accounts for half of the economy. And our answers will vary a little bit, I think, from one another, but I'd like you to kind of think about what that might be. Whereas in our economy, consumption is 2/3. Government plays a larger role in Chinese economy. Front row bonus. Okay, anyone want to share their answer? Need another minute, huh? Okay. All right. Who'd like to give us a go? Who has? All right, let's hear it.
Go ahead.
So I had 12 trillion equals 3 trillion plus 2 trillion plus 6 trillion
plus 1 trillion. That works.
Good. I like that. Yep. So that would be representative of what it is. Now, I may have told you last time that the United States has the largest economy in the world. And does that surprise you that the United States has an economy that's bigger than China's economy?
No.
All right. So, and it's bigger by a lot, wouldn't you say? So America is number one as far as the size of the GDP. China is number two, and all the other countries trail far behind. So this is the closest it is. Now, one difference that you should be aware of is that the United States economy grows by a smaller percentage than the Chinese economy does. So if you took this number and grow it by, let's say, 7% every year, and then this one you grow by only 2% a year, eventually that number will catch up to that one. You can't, if you have a head start in a race, but the other guy runs faster than you consistently, he'll catch up to you and pass you.
Why is their government? Why is their economy growing so fast?
Oh, actually, that's a great question. The reason why China's economy is growing so fast is because they've gotten away from communist control of the economy. They've allowed the free market, more of the free market and price system to answer those questions of what should they produce, how should they do it, and who should get what they produce. By opening up their borders and trading with other countries, they've experienced a tremendous growth in their GDP. Yes, question.
Yeah, I do. Before you go any further, a lot of my students want to understand how we got that answer.
Okay, so this 12 trillion, the numbers could vary. So I mentioned that the government spending is half of the GDP. So I think you started with 6 trillion as half of 12. And then you knew that China sells more to other countries than they buy from other countries. So they'd have a positive number as regarding net exports. But this might have been, half a trillion. It could have been 1.5 trillion. If you had a number for your answer that was anywhere between, say, half a trillion up to 1.5 trillion as a positive, then that would have been a good estimate. Over here, you would anticipate as well that therefore, since you're trying to add up to 12, 6 plus 1 is 7. You got to have these two numbers add up to 5. And in reality, the investment on the part of the Chinese firms is very low. It's very hard to differentiate between government spending and investment in China because of the nature of government ownership of the factors of production, because it's a communist country. So in reality, that number is a little higher than 6, and that number's closer to like half a trillion. Consumption is higher, but you got the idea of how to add them up. That's what I wanted to give you a chance to kind of do it. You could check there's a fine estimate, and then you could go back and check your numbers, and you'd see that some of these numbers are pretty close. Some of them would need a little adjusting. Yes, Luke.
Why is the consumption so much lower than in the United States?
The consumption is lower because of the relative newness of the Chinese people of being able to buy things as households. So there was, in a world where there was government housing, government control of everything, then, to go from a very low number up to 3 trillion showed tremendous growth.
Right.
So a lot more of the Chinese have cars now than they did before, and the accompanying pollution that goes with it. There's a lot more consumer spending in China than there was before. It is higher than 3, but it's relatively speaking has made leaps and bounds of growth over the past 20 years.
Okay.
Yeah. But the mature economy of the United States is primarily a consumer economy.
Right.
Yeah. And firms have determined that it's not as good to invest in the United States as it is to invest in other places where they can get a better, faster return on their investment. And that's a reflection of the policies as well. I may have mentioned that China is moving towards more free market principles. They still have a communist country. It's still a communist government, but they've adopted many free market principles. And the United States, which was the bastion of capitalism and the free market, has been moving more and more towards socialist programs and becoming not a communist country, but has certainly put out all sorts of regulations and rules on the free market and is inhibiting the growth of the GDP because of the policies, the desire to steer and put on the brakes and make sure of the outcomes rather than the methods of. It has led to a slower growth by the United States. Everybody, so obviously I have my evaluation of things, but I think that just so avoid like what sounds like a political tirade or something, you can appreciate as an economist that any policy is going to be a trade-off of and going to have some gains and some losses, or at least some desired gains at the expense of something else. And so if you for instance, even if you're in favor of a policy that taxes some particular group of people, you would recognize that tax itself is going to create a disincentive of whatever it is that you're taxing. It's going to cause some marginal behavior changes on the part of those people. So let's say we tax people in New York who make more than $500,000 this year. We're going to tax them especially high. So to the degree that they can, they're going to try to avoid that tax. Make sense? And it might mean moving out of New York. It might mean moving their income to another year. It might mean whatever they can. They'll think about whatever they can do that's not too expensive or complicated and not going to land them in jail. But if we look at tax policies and spending policies and other regulations and so forth as a trade-off, then we're thinking about it as an economist, and we can decide whether those trade-offs are worth it or not. Raising minimum wage, I think, was a good example of that. Okay? So we know the effect of raising the minimum wage. We can project what it will be. Some people will lose their jobs. Some businesses will close. Some people will be paid more. Some people will be paid the same amount but have their hours cut. Robot sales will increase. There'll be more automation that'll come in, and then you decide whether, on the whole, those trade-offs are worth it. The costs and benefits as you see them. Okay. So many times I'm expressing my conclusion, usually dissatisfaction with the interference in the policies because I perceive the cost as greater than the benefits. So, all right, now we move into a new area. This is calculating GDP for the USA, and then we'll do it for China. I'll do it for the USA first. So what we have here is per capita GDP is going to be the GDP divided by the population. Since the GDP for the United States is 19 trillion and the population is 330 million, I'm going to try to get away from a lot of these zeros by crossing off 3 of the zeros here and 3 of the zeros there. 3 of the zeros here and 3 of the zeros there. 1 of the zeros there and 1 of the zeros there. And then we're just left with 33 in the denominator. And up here we've got, looks like 5 zeros. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. So now we can punch that into our calculator. And you mind if I do that? It looks like when I take, is that 1.9 million divided by 33, and I end up with a per capita GDP, $57,576. And that's just like that. So our total GDP of 19 trillion divided by 330 million will give us a per capita GDP of 57,576. That's the total value of everything we produce in a year divided by our population. You do it for China now. Go ahead. I will accompany your calculations with some mood music. I call this per capita GDP. Time's up. What'd you come up with? 10,000. Very good. Yep. So you got 12, and how many zeros after it? 4, I think, divided by 12. Very nice. And you end up with 10,000 per capita GDP. Well done. Compare the standard of living for the two countries above. Say, well, how can I do that? As it turns out that the GDP is an indication of how the economy is growing or the pace of its growing or possibly shrinking in the case of a recession. But it's also, when divided by population, our per capita GDP is an indication of the standard of living or quality of life in that country. In other words, all of the things that are produced are then bought by someone else, produced by someone who's being paid for it. They take their paycheck, they buy some things with it. And in an economy where the GDP is growing faster than the population, as it has in China, their per capita GDP has risen up from 4,000 per person 20 years ago to now 10,000 per person, which is tremendous when you think about it. But and that's an indication of the quality of life or standard of living in those two countries. So I'd like you to compare those two countries. What can you say about it?
The cost of living in the US is higher.
Be careful because cost of living is down here. The CPI is the cost of living. But what we're looking for is the standard of living. For instance, when we look at let's say you were to visit a country and you saw that people have running water and they have, but they still have to sweep out the dirt floor in their huts. They often go without eating on a typical day. That they only have, for a family of 15, they might only have maybe 10 meals to share, and they only eat once a day, and some of them go hungry. And let me think. They may or may not have electricity. They may or may not have shoes enough for everybody. They may or may not own any kind of tools of like plowing tools or an oxen or anything like that. In our own country, take a look around, and people typically have several shoes and lots of a hard floor and a roof over their head and electricity 24/7. And more often than not, they have electronic devices that help them with a number of different pieces and jewelry and all these things that are produced, right? They're produced, and the not just like in North Korea where they produce a missile just for the military, right? North Korea, I guess we'd have their GDP would be calculated as like zero consumption, zero investment, everything's the government, right? So it's because it's completely dictated. So, but the standard of living or quality of life is a measure of how well a typical person lives in that country. And to say it's 57,000 certainly implies something that is not true. It's not like everybody gets 57,000, but there's enough stuff in the country, produced and sold in the country, that the per capita GDP is 57,000. And because it has a higher number than in China, could we say that the standard of living in the United States relative to China? Okay. So we'd say that the standard of living in the USA is greater than China? Could we say that it's like a little bit better than China, twice as good? What would you say?
5 times.
Maybe even 6 times, right? Almost 6 times better quality of life. If you prefer quality of life over standard of living as a phrase, that'll work. Standard of living is the way that we usually refer to it. But if you think of those as synonymous terms, standard of living, quality of life, then that's good. Okay? Good, okay. So now you can try this one, circle the recession. How do we do this? What's a good strategy? Yes?
We'll look for at least 2 consecutive declining quarters.
All right, so very good. So we don't know about this one, but this is an up year. That's an up quarter, rather. There's down. That's down. That's up, 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 up. Okay. So again, I gave you this sheet on Blackboard, so you can always print up another one that's blank, and you could have your answers from what you did today, and then try to work it out on your own. If you do this once or twice, this sheet between now and the day of the test, it's a good way to study, familiarize yourself with it, keep it from reinforce it in your head and so forth. Okay, so this is pretty. These are only 2 quarters that were down. Does that count as a recession?
Yeah.
Yes, it does. You need to have at least 2 consecutive declining quarters. I should have thrown in one like down somewhere, but I didn't. Anyway, you have to have at least 2. And how about over here? Where's the recession there? Give them a chance. Go ahead and where does it begin?
Quarter 3 of 2008.
Quarter 3 of 2008. Oh, here it is. Quarter 3 of 2008. There we go. And last 5 quarters, right? Good. Now, when would the government have noticed this recession?
It would be like quarter 1, 2009.
Yeah, not until quarter 1 of 2009 when they would have gotten the report on what quarter 4 was, because GDP is a trailing or lagging indicator, right? That we would have already been out of the recession here by the time they reported the recession in quarter 3 of 2006. But the recession did, in fact, that does count as a recession. Some of the recessions over the time period have been intentional on the part of the Federal Reserve. They saw us heating up, and so they purposely raised the interest rates and contracted the money supply to try to slow the economy down and put us into a little mini recession.
To avoid a bigger one?
To avoid too high of a party or a boom and a big headache to come afterwards. All right, good. Good questions on what we're doing so far? All right, let's move right along. If real GDP increases 2%, when nominal GDP increases 5%, what is the inflation level? Well, great question. It's really important to be able to know the relationship between inflation, nominal, and real. And the relationship is this: nominal minus inflation equals real. So in this case, you can pop those numbers in and you can come up with it. That's right. So nominal is 5% and real is 2%. So therefore, the missing piece must be 3%. Now, before we get off of that, I got to tell you that this question might come at you a number of different ways, and I don't want you to be surprised by it, because I might not be talking about GDP when I give you the question. I want you to be able to interlock. I want you to be able to be versatile in your understanding of nominal, inflation, and real. So let me give you a couple examples of questions I might ask. Let's say that you get a pay raise this year of 5%, but the cost of living, inflation, has gone up by 7%. So I'll give you those numbers again. All right, so you have you got a 5% pay raise, but there was a 7% CPI, cost of living. So really, how are you doing?
Worse.
worse.
2% worse.
Yeah, so you're actually at minus 2% real pay. And that's important, right? If we, let's just use a quick example. Let's say that your cost of living has gone up $1,000 a month, but your pay has only gone up by $700 a month. So even though your paycheck is bigger now than it was a year ago, you used to be able to make ends meet. Now you can't make ends meet because inflation is going faster than your pay raise. It's nice that you got a pay raise rather than nothing, but you're worse off. You need to get a pay raise that's at least as much as inflation just to stay ahead. All right, a couple other examples. Let's say that we had a interest collecting. You loan out some money at 6%, and so you're collecting interest at 6%. But inflation is 10%. So what's your real rate of return?
Negative 4%.
Yeah, negative 4%. This illustrates the idea about inflation and how it's good to owe money during inflationary times. You would gladly borrow money from someone today to buy something right now and then pay them back next year with inflated dollars that don't buy as much or are not worth as much. You would not want to loan money to somebody and charge them 6%, and when they pay you back, you can't even buy as much with the money that they give you as they could with the money that you loan to them. Let's use a quick example. You loan somebody $1,000. They pay you back, right? And then they pay back 6%, so that would be $1,060, right? However, the television cost $1,000 today, and tomorrow, or next year, it's going to cost $1,100. You see where I'm going with this? So that was, someone loaned you $1,000, they buy a TV with it, they pay back the $1,000 with interest, 6% interest, and so they pay back $1,060. And the person who gets the $1,000 and $60 back, they go to buy their own TV, but TVs are now $1,100.
So their money's worth less.
Yeah, they should have bought the TV instead of loaning it out. And when you have runaway inflation, really high inflation, of course it's good to be a borrower, bad to be a lender. Interest rates themselves will get very high. People will borrow less when that happens. People borrow less when the interest rate, people want to borrow a lot when they can borrow at a low interest rate. If the interest rates are low and inflation is high, no one wants to loan. When no one is loaning, then the economy slows down. If people need to be incentivized to loan, they'll raise the interest rates to charge more than inflation. But now people don't want to borrow money to buy a TV if they have to pay 15% interest or something, 16% interest. So then they don't borrow and don't buy, and that slows the economy down. So inflation is a serious potential problem. Some low level of inflation is thought to be desirable by some economists, the group that we know as the Keynesians. And they intentionally raise interest rates, raise inflation rate, and cause the devaluation of the currency on purpose in order to try to stimulate the economy and to get the average citizen to spend their money rather than save their money.
So they spend their money while it's worth more.
Yeah, and because by raising the inflation rate up and making it difficult for people to save, then they spend every dollar that they make, and that causes the economy to bustle along in the current quarter. But it also means that those people that are able to save, right, end up investing and doing very well. And those people that don't scrimp and save, right, just spend. And they're the ones, they're the hamsters in the wheel that never get ahead.
I was gonna say, isn't that like a kind of a superficial way of stimulating the economy? Because it's not really, there's not really an end game to it. It's really just for looks right now. I mean,
It's just for
looks,
looks,
numbers
it's
on paper,
It's very focused on the short term.
but it's not practical in the long run.
So I'm opposed to that philosophically, as well as because I'm a classical economist, I'm interested in the long run, and these short-term fiscal policies, like I'm describing, monetary policies, like I'm describing, are not sustainable. So they only work in the short run, and the long run ramifications are very bad. But that's why we want to know about inflation. So if we have a little bit of time left, let me see. I think you know the answer to this one. Why do we have recessions? I'll give you a hint. Law of delusion of. Okay. Delusion of permanence. Law of
Undulation.
Undulation.
undulation. That's right. Undulation. Right? It's just the business cycle, right? Okay. List of contributors and detractors to the quality of life which are not included in GDP. We have a pretty extensive list here. In the interest of time, I wanted to give you the chance to calculate some of those things, but I just wanted to get us up to a certain point in the next 8 minutes. So let me lay down a few of these things. Okay, so where are we? Okay. So one of the things that most of us would consider part of our quality of life is our life expectancy. In a country where the life expectancy is long, people are happier there. And yet, their life expectancy is not reflected in the GDP. So if you had two countries, one of them with a high per capita GDP and one with a low per capita GDP, if that was the only thing you were looking at, you would say the country with the high per capita GDP is a better place to live. But you're not looking at things, you're looking at one thing that's an indicator, but I'd like in this, when you fill out this part of it, I want you to consider that there's many things that are contributing or detracting from your quality of life that are not measured by the GDP. So 3 of them are life expectancy, political freedom, and household production. I dare say that political freedom might only contribute to your quality of life a little bit. But the lack of political freedom would detract from your quality of life significantly. Can you appreciate what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Let's say that you were a woman in a minority living in a country that had a high GDP, per capita GDP. Then you'd say, well, I'm living in a country that has a high per capita GDP. That indicator would tell me that I live very well. And yes, I might have some material wealth, but if I don't have some basic rights, then I would be willing to trade some of these material goods for the ability to breathe free. You follow me? Same thing with household production, although to a lesser gravitas. Did anyone have a garden this summer? I had one. I grow a garden specifically to grow tomatoes, so that at the end of the year I can have bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches with vine-ripened tomatoes. Oh my gosh, they're great. And my standard of living is high. But I'll tell you, other than the bacon, because I make my bread myself, The tomatoes have been grown from seed, so that doesn't add to the GDP. You know, I bought some gardening equipment years ago, so it doesn't add to the GDP this year. So, but my quality of life is high. And of course, around the world, there's a lot of countries, a lot of people that are living subsistence farming. They barter, they trade with one another, and their quality of life is better than the GDP would reflect. They have a lot more material wealth than is reflected in the GDP. Because if the government doesn't know about it, then it doesn't add to the GDP. So those tomatoes that I grew did not add to the GDP, but they did add to my quality of life. And if I wash my own car, that didn't add to the GDP. If I take it to Hoffman's, it does add to the GDP. You with me? Household activities of all different sorts. I'm pretty handy, so I do a lot of the repair work around my house and things like that. And when I go to Home Depot and I buy stuff, I go to Lowe's because Home Depot, I got a thing against Home Depot. But anyway, so there was I have some stories. Okay, anyway, let's fill this out. I did say in the interest of time, right? So crime, right? If you're living in an area where there's high crime, where pollution is high, where the climate is very favorable, your standard of living could be much better or worse than the GDP per capita would reflect. You with me? Don't you know people that want to go to the Caribbean if they ever strike it rich or when they get 2 weeks off, they leave a country where the GDP per capita is high and they go to a country where the per capita GDP is low and they love it. You're like, okay, there must be something in that place that's very highly desirable, because people sit on the beach and they're like, oh man, I would love this life. Then they go back to a place where they don't love it as much, because there must be that the quality of life has more to do than just what the GDP measures. Same thing, illicit activities, barter, used goods, stock market, none of those things are part of the GDP. Used good, what I do is how do I ask this question? On the test, usually 2 questions on the test, I'll make a list of things and I'll say which one of these would be part of the GDP. And then I'll put down, I traded my garden tomatoes for my neighbor's cucumbers or something like that. And then I'll say I sold my used car to a neighbor. I burned the tires in my backyard. Something like that. A bright, sunny, beautiful day shone down on me, and this lovely October. Then I bought a pack of bubble gum. Like buying a pack of bubble gum, that adds to the GDP. The rest of the stuff's not measured. Getting paid for your work. Okay, just 2 minutes here according to that. All right, so now we got the next note here. What's the difference between a leading indicator, a current indicator, and a trailing lagging indicator? And some examples for those. All right, this gets us to about where we're at. So I think we'll finish up there and go ahead and copy that off. What I'd like you to do for tomorrow is find out everything you can about CPI and unemployment. I did put a number of good things in Blackboard about economic indicators under something called course documents. There's a number of handouts there and a video. I encourage you to watch that for tomorrow. And I'll teach you how to calculate CPI, its strengths and weaknesses and applications, as well as how to calculate unemployment and its strengths, weaknesses, and applications. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Take care. Good. The Cat in the Hat. Do you guys did you see that poem that my son wrote in your textbook? It's in the front page. It's a kind of a Cat in the Hat-esque sort of poem. You should check it out. Tell me what you think about it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care, Antoine. Adios, muchachas. Any more of these, like the extras?